of those frameworks, and in other places, the frameworks were just an opportunity to kind of trade language, right? Oh, you call that a generative topic, well, we call that a theme, so now we'll just call it a generative topic. Or you call that an understanding goal, we call it a behavioral objective, so now we're just going to take the label understanding goal and put it on the behavioral objective, it's all good, right? So I got really interested in what makes the difference. Why are some communities and schools able to really dive deeply into this, and why are some really just kind of massaging words but not really doing anything? Led to another 8 to 10 years of work around this idea of how do we as teachers, as educators and administrators have conversations that go beyond the, oh, I'm so relieved somebody else has this problem too, right? When we start talking about teaching and learning, that's a lot of what, and that's a good feeling, right? I don't discount that. It's great when it can actually go beyond that, to not just, oh, how great we have the same experience, but I've actually now learned something from this conversation that I've had with you that is going to make a difference in how I engage with my students, and it's going to actually help them learn more and more deeply. So what we're talking about today is, what does that actually look like? It's a process we call collaborative inquiry, and I'm going to give you a brief description of collaborative inquiry, and then we're actually going to do one of the first steps in collaborative inquiry right here, which is identifying key questions, and then we'll go through a process for refining those questions so that they can drive our collaborative learning in settings. And I'm sorry I won't be here over the next 10 years to see your questions pan out, but I look forward to hearing how they go beyond this session. So that's a picture of what I think we're up to today. Let me just check. How does that sound to people, or do you have clarification questions you'd like to ask at this point? Okay, sounds great. Okay, so here's a place to start. I'd like to invite you to just do a short reflection. I'm going to give you a minute to think about it, and then invite you to talk to a colleague just to chat informally about the most powerful professional learning you've ever done. Now, for people who are in school, you can think about, if you've not been in an in-service setting, just think about your own learning in school and what you're doing here. The most powerful professional learning you've ever done. Actually think about it, get a really specific instance in mind. So don't just think about, oh, that course I took 10 years ago. Think about a moment in that course when you were really deeply compelled with it. So think about that, and then just think about what were the hallmarks that made it so powerful for you. What do you think fed into that? So take a minute now, think about that question, and then we're going to talk about it with each other, and then out loud in the large group. That powerful moment of professional learning for you. Okay, so let's just hear the examples first, and then we're going to step back and hear some of the qualities that made them really powerful. So, who would like to just share a very short, sentence-long description of your powerful learning experience? Yes, please.
I don't know if this is professional development. I was in college.
Yes.
When I learned about the visible thinking, I never thought about it, and that was a moment that I was like, wow, I can do all this with my children.
And were you in a workshop when you learned
Yes.
about that? Well, so the workshop setting where there's somebody running the workshop and you're engaged?
Yes, it was here for the visible thinking conference.
Ah, got it.
So
Okay, great.
It was
Thank
very
you.
powerful.
So workshop within a larger conference that was
Yes.
going on. Great. Yes.
Actually, I was doing an assignment that Dr. Salman had given us here in school, and it was one of my, it's a literacy class. And when I was able to interact with a child with particular, based on that assignment that I needed, and see how this child actually manifested at that point in time through my interaction, through the questions, through, just the experience in itself, was like my aha moment on children's development, actually, and bonding and all the side, social emotional side of a child that has to come into play with literacy.
So it sounds like that was a two-part experience. One was just being in a class and getting a specific assignment that you need to do, and then the other was the experience of carrying that out in context
Right.
with the student. Thank you. Maybe one or two others. Yes, please.
I was sharing that my aha moment, something you said, was long ago I was in Blythe school. I was a teacher in the school system.
Thought was especially powerful in moving your thinking ahead, or was it the whole thing? So was there like a talk or a
There was a
workshop or
combination, but I think one of the very first lectures that they had were they kept on repeating listening, true listening.
the pedagogy of listening, as they say.
And to me, that was the key to how to truly listen to that, and that was a breaking point.
Thank you. So as we step back, it seemed really important in creating these powerful moments of professional learning. Thoughts? Good questions, right? So somebody is, either we're asking or somebody's asking really good questions that get us thinking. What else? Time. We've got some time to actually engage and think about what's going on. Absolutely.
I believe also self-motivation.
Yeah. We feel the
Nobody
need.
make us go to that
That's
workshop
right.
or that thing.
Right. You know, we chose to enter that degree program or to go to that conference or to get into that workshop. And yeah, so we've got some motivation on our own. What else seems important?
The interaction with other participants.
Yeah, getting the chance to hear other people's perspectives. Maybe one or two other qualities that you think might be important.
Social-emotional connections, like being fully invested in that.
Being fully invested,
Part of-
yeah. Nice words. And the
Not just
socio-emotional. That's right. So it's not just social, it's not just I'm connecting with you, but I'm feeling something while I'm engaged in this. It could be excitement or confusion. Constructed. I did not know this. He died at the age of 36. Can you imagine that? I had no clue he died so young. And he really revolutionized the way we understand learning, how it happens. So fascinating. So this brings us to collaborative inquiry as a way of creating a sustainable learning context for professionals in building. I'm just going to run through some characteristics of collaborative learning as they yes. So first, there's a focus on the questions and concerns that matter most to the people who are doing the collaborative inquiry, that is the teachers. By the way, I'll make sure that everybody gets a PDF of the PowerPoint afterwards, so if you don't want to write everything down, don't worry about it. All right, so this isn't somebody else saying, I think you need to work on this. This is the group or the people involved saying, we need to really think about this and moving forward. The discussion is usually based on something concrete. That is, when we get together to do our collaborative inquiry or to have our meetings, we're focused on tangible evidence that comes out of our classrooms. Things students have done, things teachers have done. It can also be on an article. It could be, right, that could be something that we're looking at and studying, or an established, a published curriculum that we're studying and trying to understand more deeply. So those things come into play too. But it's not that we just sit and tell stories to each other. It's not, stories are very important. But in collaborative inquiry, we're actually working from things. Typically, collaborative inquiry groups use specific processes to guide conversation. We'll say more about that in a minute. And they meet regularly, typically twice a month for 1 to 2 hours. That would be a class. I have seen groups be very successful meeting monthly, but usually only after they've had the experience of meeting more frequently, so that they can they kind of have the rhythms and the skills already established, so that once a month is actually sustainable. All right, here is something known as the gears diagram around Project Zero, but it basically describes a collaborative inquiry cycle. So in the middle, you will see identifying and refining questions. So in collaborative inquiry, the questions we hold as educators are what drive the learning. And then typically what happens is we come up with a question. I'm going to describe the kind of classic process, and then I'll tell you what really happens. So we have a question. we think to ourselves, we come to our colleagues and say, I'm really wondering about this, and we talk with our colleagues about how we could pursue that question. That gives us some ideas for what we need to do in our classroom, or what kinds of evidence we need to gather. So we go out and we get some evidence from our classroom, usually in the form of student work. We come back to our colleagues, we examine and discuss it, we're using protocols to do that. We realize, oh, when I look at this student work, I see that my students seem not to really be understanding this particular kind of direction. That gives me an idea for what I need to change. I plan for the change, I make the change, I gather more data in the form of the student work, and I bring it back, right? So we have this nice little loop that's feeding. Really what happens is you identify a question, you say, oh, I'm really curious about, for instance, how students edit, how I can help students be better editors of their own writing, for example. So I've got a lot of students who will make every change I tell them to make and nothing more when I'm grading their work, right? So I'm curious about that. So I need to go out and, well, how could I focus on that? And I talk with my colleagues about it, and I realize, okay, well, maybe I need to actually go and get some evidence of my students editing and bring it back to the group. And then I realize I don't have any evidence of my students thinking while they're editing. I've got that like revised paper that they give me at the end where they've made all the corrections, but that doesn't really tell me anything about how they're thinking about their editing. So I've tried to gather evidence. I find I don't really have the evidence I need, so I go to the question, I actually come out with planning changes before I even talk to my colleagues about it, right? And in the process of planning those changes, I suddenly realize, wait a minute, okay, so I'm gonna ask students how they're thinking about their editing, and then I think to myself, actually what I really need to know is why aren't they engaging, right? Is it that my feedback is not helpful to them? Is it that they're bored with this and they're not interested? So now I've got a different question. I want to understand how my students are thinking about their editing, and that leads me to another. So already I've done this like weird little ping-ponging from questions to gathering evidence, back to questions, to planning changes, back to questions again. There's no nice cycle here, is what I'm saying. It's really messy. But that does not stop people from continuing to try to diagram really neat processes. Let me share a couple others with you. Here's an interesting one. You start with reflection, you make a plan, you act, observe, reflect. And then that leads to another plan. Act, observe, reflect, right? And so on and so forth. So another kind of neat cycle. Here's another one that comes out of work that's happening in New Zealand, which just puts it in a full circle for it. All of these are great representations of what we call collaborative inquiry. Let me say some other words that you might hear associated with this. Action research, participant research. What else do people call it sometimes? Sometimes people are doing this and they're just calling it their study group for that. I will tell you that I was part of a panel one year at the big education research conference that happens, thousands of researchers show up and share their work and talk. And we had this conversation, like, can we just get clear about this language? Like, what are we calling collaborative inquiry groups? What are we calling study groups? What are we calling critical friends groups? What are we calling, like, what's the difference among all those things? And I will tell you, we could not figure it out. So you get to choose the language you use. I'm going to use collaborative inquiry for the moment. So we have this cycle of really investigating deeply our lived daily experience in the classroom. That's what this is about. And what is that in contrast to? Well, let's just look here. Here's a story of professional learning that occurs in a lot of places, right? So in a lot of places, if I don't know something, that's a sign of weakness, right? How can I, as a 25-year veteran, walk into a group of colleagues and say, I am really, really confused about how to assess my students' learning, right? I'm not satisfied with what's going on, but I've been teaching for 25 years and I haven't figured this out by now? It's hard to admit that some places. Having answers is essential, more important, in fact, than raising the questions. Meetings are typically for announcements and logistics. We don't have time to talk about teaching and learning. And finally, this thing that the researcher Judith Warren Little talks about, the persistence of privacy. So no matter how much we talk, I go into my classroom, I close the door, and the teaching and learning is between me and the students. Okay. What's a better story? Professional learning, and this is, by the way, I'm riffing on something that Ron Richard talks about in terms of the story of learning for students. So this is being adapted now for teachers. Professional learning is actually a product of thinking and reflecting, not just being in the classroom and doing the work. You could be a 35-year veteran And if you've never taken the time to step back and reflect and think, there's no reason to believe that you are any better on the last day of your 35th year than you were on the first day of your first year. Right? Professional learning and thinking are not just individual practices, they're also collaborative practices, right? We're talking Lev Vygotsky here. Learning about learning and teaching involves uncovering complexity, not just coming up with answers, right? It can't be made simple. Workshops like this can be really helpful, but nothing substitutes for that deep work in our classrooms reflecting and puzzling about what's going on there. Our learning as professionals, it evolves, it changes with time. We don't understand classroom discipline on here in our 10th year the way we understood it in our 2nd year, nor will we, and it will be different in another 5 years. And finally, professional learning is about getting personally involved. We talked about that in the context of it matters that you care about what's going on. It matters that you see the value in what you're trying to learn and how that applies in your own classroom. And questions not only drive collaborative inquiry, but they are also the outcomes, right? So sometimes coming up with a better question or a new question is a powerful piece of evidence of your learning, not coming up with a response yet. All right, I'm going to skip over a few goals. So you will get these in the whole packet, so you'll have time to read through at your leisure. But let me just say that here's what's happening in collaborative inquiry. We're basically agreeing to learn in public, right, with our colleagues. Now, it's not a huge public. We're not learning in front of hundreds of people, but we have a group of colleagues that we're actually going to engage in learning with. It helps us understand the limits of our own perspectives, right? We need other people's perspectives to get better, and it helps us embrace those limits as the starting place for our own learning. Now, here's a spectrum of professional development. Take a minute and think about that powerful learning moment that you described, and just kind of mentally array it on this thing, right? So there's workshop and training on one end, there's coaching and mentoring on another, and then there's these collegial conversations and inquiry groups on the far end. Just think about that for a second. Courses probably are on this end of the spectrum. Everybody kind of see where you are on that piece. And the reason I'm asking you to do that is because even though we're going to be focused on this end down here, that doesn't mean the other parts aren't incredibly valuable. Okay? So I just want to acknowledge that there are lots of different powerful ways of engaging with professional learning. I make the case on this end just because it tends to get the least amount of attention in the spectrum school. So that's why we're really focused over here, but it's not dismissing these others. All right, why are these things different? One question is, who's setting the agenda? So in the case of workshop and training, the leader or the expert is the person who says, here's what we're going to do today, just like I kind of did here at the beginning of this session. If it's a coaching, mentoring situation, typically it's negotiated. So the person who's being coached can say, I really need help with this, and the person who's doing the coaching can say, I see that, and let me also suggest that you might need a little help over here too. In a collegial conversation or collaborative inquiry group, the participants decide. They set the agenda of the work. Second question, who's got the expertise? Who's bringing something to the table? So in the first case, it's actually the leader or the expert. I'd be pretty annoyed if I showed up for a class or a workshop and the workshop leader said, well, I don't really know much about this. I thought maybe we could just talk about it. We'll figure it out together. It's like, I paid money, I scheduled my time, tell me what you know, right? In terms of the coaching, again, it's a shared dynamic. So the coaches definitely got some expertise. That's often why they're in the coach role. But they also assume that the person being coached has expertise in their own experience that they're bringing to the table. And finally, who's got it in the collegial groups? It's the participants. So we assume when we do collaborative inquiry that if we sit together and delve deeply into our work, that we all actually have valuable things to share with one another and that we can learn from one another. There's so many places where I come in as the person giving the talk, and in the course of the conversation, I listen to people and I'm like, there is so much expertise in this room to be tapped, and there's just no way for people to find each other and have that conversation. Part of me is thinking it would be so much cheaper to let people talk together and share their expertise than to fly me in from 7,000 miles away to stay here for 4 days and do this. But it's just not the model that we typically have, right? So So the argument here is for expanding our model of what comprises good professional development or professional learning. All right, here's what participants in collaborative inquiry groups do. They commit to making their work and thinking public to their colleagues. They commit to learning with and from the other members of their group, that they're going to invest not just in their own learning, but in the learning of the other group members. Finally, they agree to embrace an inquiry stance. The inclination to observe, to question, to wonder, to not go for the quick fix, right? To really delve deeply into things. So what makes collaborative inquiry groups different from every other group meeting? Because there is no shortage of meetings in schools, right? I mean, we all go to meetings, a lot of meetings sometimes. So why are collaborative inquiry group meetings different? There we go. First of all, the goals and the questions are generated by the members of the group, not by somebody externally who's setting the agenda. Oh, I don't know why this keeps disappearing like that. The groups are committed to learning, not just to task completion, right? So I see a lot of, the term PLC, professional learning communities, that gets batted around a lot. I see a lot of PLCs that are neither professional nor about learning nor about community, right? What they really are task forces. Somebody has been charged with coming up with the third grade benchmarks for the new science exam. Somebody has been tasked with reviewing these 3 curriculums and deciding which of them we're going to be using in the grade, right? Those are not, they could be learning situations, but usually what they are task completion situations. We need to get something done, and that interferes with the discussion usually focuses on tangible evidence of learning. There are a whole bunch of faculty meetings that happen and a whole bunch of department meetings where there's not nary a shred of student work in sight, right? We're just talking about what's going on. That wouldn't happen in a collaborative inquiry group. And finally, there are specific processes used. Thank you. Does that help? Are people going to go to sleep if we do that?
Yeah, that's
okay. If we get like a middle ground where we can just bring it down over the thing, over the slide. That would be helpful. We could get rid of these slides. That would be great. So there are specific processes used in collaborative inquiry groups. That's different. So protocols, right? I know you are all familiar with a number of those. Many of you are familiar with a number of those. That's different from an agenda, right? An agenda is just a list of topics. Here are the things we're going to cover today. A protocol actually says how we're going to engage with those topics. In fact, we are going to engage in a short protocol right now. So first steps in collaborative inquiry groups, you form groups, you decide on your meeting time and place, you establish norms. I'm not going to go into that today, and you draft and refine questions. This is the piece that we're going to work on today. Now, it may not be, if you were doing this collaborative inquiry thing, it wouldn't necessarily happen in that order, right? Things are a little messy. We might actually form a group and then decide on our questions, or I might have a question and go searching for other people who share that question in order to form the group. Okay, so here are the characteristics of a good question for driving your collaborative inquiry. It's personally and professionally important to you. You care about it. Maybe it's the thing that's, I sometimes say it should be the thing that's keeping you up at nights, right? The thing that you constantly are thinking about, whether you're in the shower or in the car, right? This is going on. It's relevant for other classrooms and situations. And this criterion is just the check against idiosyncrasy, right? So if we're doing collaborative inquiry, we want to be exploring a topic that can inform everybody's learning in the group. That doesn't mean that everybody has to care about that topic equally, right? Doesn't mean that, here's a good way to put it. If at the end of your study, your collaborative, your inquiry process, could you go to a conference and do a little presentation on it and have other people say, yeah, that's kind of interesting, I'd like to hear about that. If the answer to that is yes, then you're in the ballpark here. It directly addresses student learning. So I might make the case that, okay, you know what? My question for my personal inquiry is, I really want to understand how to organize my files better. Because you know what? If I could get my 30 years of curriculum files organized in a good way, I'd be able to find things more easily, and then I'd be able to create better lesson plans, and ultimately, my students would learn more. It's like, okay, that's kind of connected to student learning, but there's a really long process there to get from what I'm exploring to the student learning. We want that to be connection to be tight. Remember, our ultimate goal here is we want to help students learn more and more deeply. So the question should be focused there. It's the right size. Maybe this is the Goldilocks criterion. It's not too big. Here's a question somebody started off a group with last thing, like, what is this country's obsession with standardized tests? That's my inquiry question. Like, okay, I hear the passion. I can hear that that's personally and professionally meaningful to you. It's very relevant to other classrooms. It does directly have a connection to student learning in terms of what happens in schools. But that's an awfully big question to put out and try to make progress on in the course of a semester or a year or even 6 weeks. Some of these cycles are quite short. So can we frame that in a way that actually brings it home and puts it in the realm of being able to explore it? I think the version that we got to was something like, how do I help the parents of the kids in my class understand that there are other ways of demonstrating learning beyond the test score? It's like, okay, there's an interesting inquiry question that we could start to do some exploration with. Now, I put this researchable in parentheses because I worry that our model of research in this country is quite impoverished. In other words, we tend to think of the double-blind controlled study as the only way that research can happen. So if I can't A, put a numerical value on the thing that I'm looking at, and B, find a perfectly matched control group that I can compare, then it's not valid. And let me tell you that that's simply not true. There are other paradigms for carrying out research, including qualitative research, that don't involve that mindset. So researchable, but don't think in that narrow term of quantifiable double-blind controlled study. Not like that. So let's look at some sample questions that people have asked in the context of this. How can I help English language learners engage productively in group work around word problems? This was asked by a middle school math teacher who loved the reality of word problems, but you know what, if the kids struggle with language, now they've got two struggles, the language and the math. So that was the puzzle there. We talked about this one, how can I help my students become better editors of their own writing? And I loved this one. One teacher just asked, do I talk too much? It's like, what a great question. How would we explore that? He actually, over the course of a semester, came to the conclusion that when he talked less in giving students directions, the students did deeper work in their class, just looking at the classwork that they did, which I thought was fascinating for it. Okay. So, you know this. The questions are important. That's everything that I'm saying here. I'm so sorry for that. Just take that off. So here's the choosing a question protocol. We're actually going to do a little experiment with this protocol here in this session. So what happens is we're going to sit in groups of 3, and the it could be groups of 4 too. And we'll probably just do one round of this. So somebody in the group will volunteer to share their draft question, and I'm going to give everybody time to think about their question before we get into these groups. And then the group will ask a few minutes of clarifying questions, just 2 minutes. So what do you mean by this word, or what context are you working in, or things like that. Really simple, straightforward questions. Then the presenter is going to say why they care. Why is this question personally and professionally important? And then the group members will ask a few questions about that. So if you're not convinced, if you're listening to the presenter in your group and you're not really convinced that this question matters to them, probe that a little bit. Ask, why is this the thing that keeps you up at night? Or understand a little bit more. Now, in talking about relevance to other classrooms, what's going to happen is the group members are actually going to respond first. What connections are you as a group member seeing to the presenter's question? Have you seen an issue like that come up in your own work? Could you imagine being interested in the findings about such a question? So the presenter is just going to listen to the 2 or 3 groupings talk about that question. Again, just very briefly for just a couple of minutes. Related to student learning and thinking, the group's going to respond first. How do we see connections between this question and improving student learning? And then finally, we'll have just a brief minute of, how does this question sound? Is it too bored? Okay, we don't want bored questions. We don't want it to be too broad either. Yeah, sorry, I missed that on the spell check. So the size should be neither too broad nor too narrow. And then, we're not going to do number 6 because we're going to do number 6 in the next round. So just hold that for the moment. All right, so there's the process. what we're going to do now is I'm going to give everybody just a couple of minutes to sit. You might find it helpful to do a little bit of writing. Think about your questions. Think about what you puzzle about in relation to your teaching or your work as an educator. Think about the question that says, man, if I could just figure out this thing, I would be a much better teacher. I would be so much more helpful to my students. Right? That's the kind of realm that you want to focus on. So you're going to think about your question for a couple of minutes. Then we're going to get it together into small groups. And then I'm going to talk us through the steps of this protocol. And one person in the group will need to volunteer to share out a question and get the colleagues' feedback. And that whole process is going to take us about 15 minutes. So it goes very quickly. We're just really getting a taste for the question. There's a method to the madness. We make this first round of vetting questions very quick because you don't want anybody to get married to their question too quickly, right? This is like quick and dirty. Let's just get a draft question out there. Let's stir up some conversation around it. Now I've got some of my colleagues thinking, I can go back and revise my question if I want to. So if it feels kind of like, oh, this is going fast, yes, it's going fast, and there's a deliberate reason for that. In the next step, we typically take a little more time in the refining, but I'll describe that for you when we get there. All right, any questions about the process? Okay, so take a couple of minutes now. Think about your own questions. And if you have a hard time coming up with one, just please know that you're not alone. I think there's a lot in this world that teaches us not to pay attention to our questions, right? To listen to everybody else's opinions and not to really trust our gut on it. So sometimes this process is not easy, but try it. What questions do you have that you think might be interesting to explore in the context of collaborative inquiry? And it's okay to be hypothetical. You know, you're not getting married to this question. All right. Take a couple minutes. Room and find some people you don't know to talk to. I mean, I know you all kind of know each other a little bit, probably, but find people you don't regularly get to talk to. Let's take advantage of this perspective sharing that we can do. And then the trick is going to be, you have to actually kind of sit for this so you can sort of see each other. Now, the seating here is this kind of the lecture style that's not helpful to us right now. So let me invite you to, if you need to drag chairs off to the side or out here in the front to kind of organize yourselves so you can sit where you can actually see each other, please do that. So we're going to take about 5 minutes to just kind of organize ourselves. Maybe if you really want to help yourself to a cookie as you're doing that, you can do that to keep your blood sugar up. But please organize yourselves into groups of 3 or 4. Find a way to sit so you can actually see each other and hear each other. Introduce yourselves and decide who's going to be the person to share their question. So those are your logistics, and if you want to get a little something as you do it, please feel free. Okay, take 5 minutes, get yourselves organized. How protocols work, for those who are unfamiliar. We go step by step. The steps are typically timed. I'm going to keep track of time for us. I'll let you know how much time we have for each step. It will feel fast. It will not feel like normal conversation. And I may interrupt you, and I'm just going to beg your indulgence as the designated facilitator for our group. I'm just going to apologize to everyone right now. I am so sorry if I interrupt your thought. Keep in mind that we have a break coming up, and you are very welcome to continue your conversation and finish that thought and go back and catch up with someone at the break if you want. All right, so here's the first step. The person who is sharing the question, the designated presenter or questioner, is going to read their question out loud to the group and say a little bit about why it matters to you. And then the group can ask a question or two. I'm sorry, we say the question and then we get the clarifying questions. Actually, you know what? Almost certainly you will find yourself talking about 1 and 2 together. That happens a lot. So you're going to say the question, people are going to ask clarifying questions. In the next 2 to 3 minutes, let's call it 3 minutes, the presenter is going to share a question, the group's going to ask clarifying questions if you have them, and presenter, you are going to convince the group that this is the most important thing to you right now. Okay, so, and the group's going to ask questions about that too, like, really, are you sure this matters more than that? Is this really? So 3 minutes, it's going to be short. Share that question, get clear about it, and get clear about why it matters. Go ahead. about the question you just heard, right? You've got a lot of questions. You've got a lot of questions about what they mean. It's okay. Just go with what you've got and move on to this next question. And this is a question actually for the group members first. So if you're a group member, think about that question you just heard and ask yourselves, how might this kind of question be relevant to my own work, whatever that work is, as a classroom teacher, as a student, as an administrator, whatever. So reflect a little bit on the connections that you're seeing between that person's question and your own experience. Presenters, if you just shared a question, your job right now is to listen. Just listen. Now I sometimes say, okay, you can participate a little tiny bit, but almost always that results in the presenter doing all the talking again. So group mates, keep your presenter in check. Don't let them do all the talking. But if they want to share a little bit, that's okay. Group members, talk to each other about how you see the connections between this question and your own. Go ahead.
Started with the echolocation. I wanted to do like a journey for echolocation to teach the children about the new. Well, echolocation is something that is very old, but now it's being in the news because of the damage to the wells with the sonar technology and everything. And I wanted to do a journey to make the students aware of that. But as I started to developing the journey and doing the question and doing the research, I realized that that topic was too specific. Was too specific and too complex for the age that I wanted to target. So I had to figure out how to include that topic into a broader topic so that it would be accessible to the children. So that the question that I developed was how the wells connects to the ocean ecosystem and how the wells balance the whole ecosystem. And that's something that we as adults don't even know, that the wells really
in essence create like a split. What her question is how do I make sure that I don't ask too much? That I don't. If you look at our question, right, so in essence, I appreciate that you shared what it is that you do in your classroom. I'm not sure that it relates to her question.
Yes and no, because we do a lot of groups, and I work in a lot of groups in my class. But when they're older and I need to teach them like math and reading and science, it's harder for them to grab a group because we have to keep a schedule, because I did do pre-K 3 and it's different. You have more centers, with my class we try to do the same thing, but in a way they all have to learn the same thing at a certain time.
I think that question is very relevant to all of us because even though you have a very particular context that you have your IPs, I think that in our classroom is pretty much what you're saying, is that you have different ages, and even if you have the same age range, let's say, of 6 months or so, still each child learns differently. So I think that in your particular context, it applies differently.
On this a little bit more, trying to cycle back to things that you shared, but is this going to lead us to deeper student learning and thinking? What do you think? And are there some tweaks that you might suggest that would help it focus even more directly on improving student learning and thinking? Again, group members, you're going to talk about this. Presenters are mostly going to listen. If you want to chime in with a question, you want to ask somebody to clarify what they're saying, that's okay, but don't take over the conversation. Listen to your group mates. Okay, go ahead.
It's going to affect what you said, a learning process, because it's like, for what you said and what you said, I understand that the parents are the ones who wants the system. And in a way, they're an obstacle from their own children to learn the way that the generation to learn. And I know that because you have the same issues as a preschool teacher, and you have the same issues as a preschool teacher. So I think we can make a research, or we can lead to a research how the parents' involvement are really a part of it, or they just following the trend. they are not thinking about how the children need to be.
Yeah, your question was good. I think.
What do you think? Come on, Tabata.
You know, the pressure of the video stuff. I think that's a part of it. And it's like there are allies too. And it's like, and they know their child best too. So it's an ongoing conversation.
Maybe we knew how to explain to them, how to have them think beyond. Sometimes it's hard for us to explain, you know, why the child needs this, why the child needs time, why we need to respect the child in his or her own way. It's hard to explain, and for that it's a process that we need time. And in this community, you don't have to,
And they need like a proof how evidence my children is learning if I don't see something. So again, we're going back to the outcome and not the process.
Time. Thoughts more in this part of the conversation. So just make it a group conversation about the size of this question. Does it feel right? Are there ways to make it a little more focused or ways to open it up a little bit more if you think it might need that? So check in for about a minute and a half with your group and then we'll come back together.
Everybody's on the whole. When it's time to put all the ideas together, it's really fun. Probably because we're saying
5 more seconds.
Works.
And time. Okay. Before we roll right into the next thing. So this is just a very short pause to make any notes you need to make or just to think about what you heard. Here's our pause. In your group sharing a question, you might want to thank your group mates for all their thinking about their question. Might you do that right now? and group mates, let's thank the presenters for being willing to volunteer to put their stuff out there. So thank you all for volunteering to share your questions. And now, I hope what happens now is that at least in each group, we've got kind of a working question. You might feel like it needs some revision after that conversation, or you might feel like you are spot on and headed in the right direction. But here's what we would do next. We've got a draft question, now we need to refine it. And here are the steps we take to refining it. So, usually what happens at this stage is that the presenter is actually writing their question up someplace big. And let's see, would somebody like to, can I hear like a couple of the questions that got discussed? Just like read it off to me. What question did you focus on? I just want an example to think about. Yeah.
My question was, how do you know when you're helping too much or helping too little?
Oh, what a great question. How do you know when you're helping too much or too little? Working with students. Yeah, what a great question. Okay, so actually I'm just going to run with that one because I want us to be able to take a break here shortly. Thank you for volunteering that. So we hear the question, how do I know if I'm helping too much or too little? And now we ask 3 things of that question. First of all, what words in that question do we need to define a little more? So how do I know whether I'm helping too much or too little? Okay, what do we mean by help? First of all, what are all the ways that help can look in this? What else?
What is too much?
That's right. Do we have ideas about how to parse that out? Even at this point, although the question's kind of about that, so we might not be totally clear in that. How do I know whether I'm helping too much or too little? So we need to get clear about what helping means in this particular context. What assumptions underlie that question? What assumptions is that question based on?
Well, in that question, for example, the students will learn because of my help.
So yeah, there's an assumption that there's some connection here between my helping and student learning. Yeah, great. That's an assumption there. What else? What's another assumption that might underlie that question? Yep. Okay. So if we focus on the little part, that I might not actually be giving them enough in order to learn. Yep. Possible. What's another assumption?
We're the ones that have all the information, so it's too much or too little. I know it all.
I've got it, and I'm deciding whether what I'm doing is too much or too little. Right. And that we're sort of the agents in there, yeah? What else might be an assumption?
But there might exist a balance between our intervention and there might be a point where we can meet together and work on.
There's an assumption that we can get to the Goldilocks moment, right? I'm giving just the right amount of help in this thing. Yeah, so all of those assumptions are kind of embedded here and operating in this question. Good for us to know, because sometimes when you surface the assumption, you can look and say, oh, well, maybe actually there is no balance point, right? Maybe we want to ask a question just about more like a pendulum swing here, about at what moments during the year, rather than in what moments in an individual interaction might students want more help. Or we might decide, you know what, maybe I am not the most important agent in this question. Maybe what I should be thinking more about is how do I get students engaged with each other in a way as opposed to doing it, yeah. So all of those are possibilities, and we're not pushing any of those on you, we're just kind of playing it out here. Okay, here's the next one. What questions does this question make us think of? And this is the brainstorm moment, where we're just gonna toss out, now we may ask some questions about those assumptions that we named, or it might just be, oh yeah, that reminds me of a question I've been thinking about, which is da-da-da. So what questions does this question make you think of, or remind you of?
Something you mentioned, how can students support each other?
How could students support each other? Mm-hmm. Sure, what else? What other questions?
How do children learn?
How do children learn? What a great question. What else?
How do you determine the moment when you need to intervene?
Yeah, what clues am I looking for to decide whether or not I intervene? What am I basing that judgment on when I do? Sure. What else?
How do I know which way to take in the sense of helping children?
Right, what's my decision-making process like in that moment? So what clues am I going on to make a decision about whether to intervene? And then what am I basing my judgment on about how to intervene in that moment? Sure. What other questions seem connected to this?
How are the students participating in the process?
How are the students participating in the process? Sure. So we could keep going. We could probably fill a board with questions. This is such a rich question. We could spin out a lot. So we've just sort of massaged that question and opened it up a little bit. And now we would come to this identify a hypothesis. So this is where, so you would ask, do we answer the question yet? At some point, it actually is helpful to stop and think to ourselves, all right, if I had to answer this question right this minute, what does my gut say? Now that doesn't mean that that's the answer necessarily, but sometimes just your own gut feeling about gives you more directions to pursue. So, do you want to hazard a guess at what your hypothesis might be?
Well, in my class, I sometimes feel that I'm giving them, like I'm helping them too much, and then it causes them not to think on their own.
Yeah. So
With my
your
group of kids.
got it. So your concern is I'm helping too much. And that leads my students not to think as much as they otherwise might. Great question. Okay. If we were going to start exploring this question, what data sources would we look for? What kinds of data could we collect? And by the way, you know when I say data, I'm not talking about the numbers. There may be some numbers involved here, but that's not fundamental. What data would help us explore this question? What could we look for?
For example, how are children engaging?
Right. How are children engaging and
how long?
Yeah, and let's. So how long are they talking?
How long are they staying with the material? If it's
How long
early
are they
childhood, for
focused?
example, are they turning around and inviting a peer or the teacher after wandering? So a lot of observation.
So observational data that we would get by just watching the students interact at particular times. What other sources of data might we look for? What things could we do to explore this question?
The type of questions they ask initially, are they prior thinking questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
They actually think behind the way they answer the question, they approach the issue.
Right. Right, so again, this would either be observational, or we might need to run a video camera in the corner of the room for 15 minutes or so to capture some part of it so we can look back at the transcript, but absolutely. What else?
What is the teacher doing?
can we get some reporting? And by the way, our memories of what we did in a class are notoriously unreliable. So just like walking out and saying, okay, I know what I did in there and when I interacted, you really need help with that documentation. So either you've written out your plan, you know you're following that plan, or you run the video camera or your voice memo on your iPhone. I do that a lot. I'll just I really want to remember this moment, I'll just hit the voice memo on my iPhone, I'll capture a conversation, and then I got something to listen to afterwards. Yeah.
I like that idea.
Yeah, it's so helpful. It's really, and then I can listen to it in the car on the way home. I just plug it into my player. Do a little reading. It's nice. Any other ideas for data we could collect?
Perhaps adding a doubting question that questions the theories that are going on. So.
Right, so let me just see if I understand this. One thing we might do is, I as the teacher might decide to ask more often, what makes you think that? Or can you tell me why you're doing that right now? Or convince me, I'm not so sure, the way you just said, and see what the students say in response to that. That could
to refine the theory.
To refine, yeah. And are you talking about a doubting to the question itself? Or to the,
right,
in the
like
classroom?
The child has a theory. So you believe the theory, theory repair. You then ask a question where, like, for example, do you want me to give an example?
Yeah. No, I think I get where you're going with this. So, and we might compare that kind of intervention to a different kind of intervention and see, are we getting different results with the students? And again, what's happening is you're collecting these data, and then you're showing up at your next group meeting saying, here was my question, here's a short excerpt from a student conversation. Let's look at this together and look at my role and the student's role and talk about how much is too much? What's the quality of my intervention or my interaction with them? And what's the quality of their response? And what questions does that raise for us? So we would choose a protocol that would help us analyze those data as a group, which would then give you some ideas about what you want to try next as you continue to understand what this question means. And by the way, the question itself will change the minute you start looking at the data. That's totally typical. So nobody should feel locked into a question just because this is where I started. The evolution of that question is an important part of the learning process. Okay, full stop. Longer term questions so that you're actually building from meeting to meeting and week to week, learning more and more about these questions, drawing on the things your students are doing every day. Okay. So let me pause and just see if you all have questions about the collaborative inquiry process that we haven't yet talked about. I just had another idea for how we could do this. Why don't we take a break? It gives you a little percolating time. And we're going to come back together at 10 after 11. And before we move into the next session, I'll invite your questions about what we just did. And then, so that gives you a little thinking, and you'll wonder about stuff at the break, and that's good. Let's do that, because I think we do need a break. So let me just say, that was a whirlwind tour of collaborative inquiry. Thank you all for joining in such good spirit and participating. What we're going to do after we come back from the break is hear some reflections on this process, and then we're actually going to do some looking at student work together and have a good time doing that. So, off to the collaborative inquiry, or that whole choosing a question and what that process was like.
How to make it public.
How to make it public. Can you say a little bit more about what you mean by public?
I don't mean the question specifically that she raised, but how to make public the fact that teachers are meeting on a regular basis and making discoveries and are learning.
Yes.
How to make that public.
Agreed. That's a great question. I can share with you that a few of the schools that I've worked with, working on training, they actually have a day toward the end of the school year when the teachers all share their what they learned. They each do either short board, they put up display boards, or they do short presentations about the process of their inquiry over the course of the year. And that's a very, we actually just did a session like this back in, we used to say the end of the school year, but the truth is, at least in Massachusetts, at the end of the school year is testing, and then you got to worry about the kids kind of checking out because they're not focused anymore. So really what we mean by the end of the year is March. for bringing inquiry to a close. And typically, you're not starting until October, right? Because September is just like kids coming and going, getting the classes settled, et cetera. So between March and, say, February, teachers are engaged in collaborative inquiry. They're coming, they're meeting together, they're making progress on their individual questions. Sometimes a group will decide to share a question, and they'll all work together on that one question. Sometimes each member of the group has a different question, and they take turns sharing and getting feedback. And then in February and March, everybody who's involved in this takes time to summarize their thinking, what they've learned. We actually have a protocol for this called the leaving a question protocol. So I've come to the conclusion, here's where I am. And then they put together these public displays, and sometimes they're just arrayed in a room like the faculty room. And in a few places, they do this really lovely reception where all other faculty members are invited, the superintendent is invited, and the teachers, you can browse, and they give everybody little discussion questions. They say, get a partner, walk around the room, and talk about these questions as you walk, and then there's a sharing session at the end. So it's a great question. Different schools worked out different ways of getting out the word that this is going on and that this is what we're learning as a result. It's a great question to ask.
Tina, you mentioned making this public, and you mentioned working with public schools. Most of us are in private schools, which give a little room for reflection, but not everybody. There are some people that work in public schools, and we were talking with Jeanette. Do you mind sharing that concern that you have?
I wanted to share with you that one of the biggest challenges is the way that the school system works. That I had a personal experience. One of the reasons why I decided to go into the private sector and open, my own preschool, it's because it was so difficult, not impossible, but it was so hard and so difficult to create the spaces of collaboration among the colleagues, because technically there was no time, physical time, where we worked together with the principal to create the schedule where the teachers could have a space where they can sit down and reflect on their work, create this kind of questions, and work together. And we couldn't figure it out, not only for the requirements that were coming from, the actual.
It can even be a real issue in independent schools, right? Especially if you get beyond, once you start getting up around, 3rd or 4th or 5th grade, parents are thinking about the SATs and the ACTs and the IB and, whether or not my kids are going to score well. And it adds a layer of pressure on you. If you want to diverge, they get really anxious about it. So what do you do? Well, the first thing is, if you're in a place that's I've got 2 quick ideas I can put out, although you're absolutely right, this is like another week-long conversation for us to have. The first thing that you can do is take what's given as the object of inquiry, right? So you can do inquiry, you can do collaborative inquiry on these standards and how our students are engaging with these standards. I was sharing at the break, both my sisters are teachers, and I'm very careful about, if they ask me, I will share with them, but I never, I don't want to push my stuff on them. I'm really careful about that. But my youngest sister was teaching in a school. She works with English language learners, and they're all full inclusion in California, which is where she teaches. So she and her colleagues had worked really hard to adapt this one curriculum that they had been given, using this kind of inquiry process of investigating, all right, if we make this change, let's try it. Go do it. Get the student work. Bring it back. Let's look. Are we seeing a difference? No. All right, let's try something else. This seems to work, right? So they engaged in this process. They got some really great data about how it was working. And the next year, when the superintendent or whoever decided that they're going to do a new curriculum this year, right, because out with the old, in with the new, they took all their data down to the superintendent's office and said, look, we've actually figured out that this is working for our kids, and look at the difference between what they're writing in September and what they're writing in March when we do these kinds of things, and we would like permission to keep doing this rather than switch to the new one that they're doing. And he looked at it and said, you're right, this seems to be working for you, go ahead for that. So they got this, right? So you in that kind of, I know, so cool, right? You can figure out ways to work with that thing. Now, the problem of time is serious, and I will tell you, there are 3 ways you get time to do this work. Maybe there are more, and if there are more, tell me, because then we're going to write about it, and we're all going to retire and get rich. But here are the 3 that I know about. And I'm just going on, this is what schools who are able to do this, what they actually do. So the first thing is, I sometimes say you can buy time, make time, or borrow time, right? Those are your options. So the people who buy time do this. They go out and they get a grant, that then, and that brings in some money that lets them either pay teachers to stay after school to do this work, or pay substitutes to come in and rotate through the school to free up groups of teachers at various times. A small percentage of schools do that, not very many. There are people who borrow time, and borrow time looks like this. They just go find people outside of school, just what you're saying. They just decide it's important, and this is what I want to do, and so this is what I'm going to do. Not unlike your visible thinking group here, right? You're all coming together saying this matters to us. It's not like people are paying you, it's not like people are telling you, it's like this helps us do our work. And I will say that there are, you are in proud company here. There's a group in Philadelphia that has been running for about 30 years now. This works like that. Teachers come together from across schools to meet, share their work, discuss their questions, and move on. There's a group that's been meeting at the Ed School at Harvard for, say, about 20 years now. And the membership shifts over that time. It's not always the same people coming every time, but the core of that group moves forward. So that's another way you can do it. But again, that's not the most common way. The most common way that people find to do this work is to take the meeting time that's already built into the school day, faculty meetings, department meetings, grade level meetings, and you make the decision that all of that administrative stuff that we're doing in those meetings, we're actually not going to do anymore. We're going to put those in emails and send them out to people like that. And we're going to co-opt those meetings for doing this kind of work, for sharing our teaching and learning and for developing our questions. That is the most common way that people figure out the time to do this. And I will warn you, and the big fear that everybody has is, look, if I don't say this, right, if I as the department chair or the principal don't stand up and say this to the group, they're not going to know it, and problems are going to happen. Balls are going to get dropped, it's going to be an administrative nightmare. And in some places, it is an administrative nightmare for about 6 weeks, right? And then everybody figures out, oh, I guess I really do need to read my email. Oh, I guess I really do need to go and check my email because people aren't going to tell me this, right? So there's a learning curve involved in figuring out how to do that. How do you get those things that are currently hogging meeting time off the table and into some other forum? But most places who figure out how to do it say they'll never go back. Anyway, so that's how most of the places that I know are doing, figuring out how to do it, which does not make it easy. Sometimes all you can get is 30 minutes. What do you do with 30 minutes? You can still do something with 30 minutes. Yeah, it's possible. Some of these protocols we use, they can be shrunk into 30 minutes, and you can still get something valuable. There's a school in New York that I work with that decided they do a version of the tuning protocol, or sort of a hybrid tuning protocol, letter of feedback that you all may be familiar with, and they had to shrink it to 18 minutes. Because what they had was a 30-minute meeting time, and by the time everybody got into the room, and then everybody was running out to take care of their stuff, that's what they had to work with. It's like, and they still got some great stuff out of it. So, would it be better if we all had 2 hours every week? Sure. But that often is not the reality. And so, what do we do with the time we have? Great question. Okay. Any other questions? People want to pose? We're going to imagine that we're a group that does not yet have a question to pursue, right? We're getting together, we want to share our work with each other, but we haven't really locked in on our inquiry question. The protocol that we're about to do, yes, please.
You would ask us to remind you about this part, we were going to do something.
Oh, right. I'll need to be reminded again in like 20 minutes when we get to the student work. Yes, and it was a respect. Thank you so much, because I would have forgotten, but now I'll remember when we see the things up. And actually, when we get to the part where I'm telling you the context of the work, I'll fill in that piece that was relevant to something that you were saying yesterday. The protocol that we're about to do, the one called the Collaborative Assessment Conference, is what we call a question-generating protocol, right? Now, let me just check. How many people in the room have ever used a protocol or a guided structure, right? We did one for the Choosing a Question project. How many people have ever used a protocol or a guided structure for looking at student work of any kind? If you've ever done it, just stick up your hand so I'll get a sense. Okay, so some experience in the room and some people who are really new. So I'll say a little bit more framing for the people that are really new. And I'll also invite the people who are really experienced to kind of chime in with their own thinking about how this has worked for you over time. So we start with a clear structure, and different structures have different purposes. Just like tools in a tool chest, right? You do one thing with a screwdriver, you do another thing with a hammer. So think of protocols as tools. This particular tool is designed for helping us reflect on our own teaching and explore our questions, right? To surface what's important to us. And the way it's gonna do that is we all start by looking at a single piece of student work, and we dig into that work deeply. And then at the end, instead of giving advice to the presenter, which is often what happens in a protocol, that's a problem-solving protocol, instead of giving advice to the presenter, what we're gonna do is think about our own work in light of what we've just talked about. So let me be clear. The Collaborative Assessment Conference, which is the protocol we're doing, is not about grading student work. It's not about solving a problem for the presenter who brought the work. It's really doing two things. One is asking us to take the learner perspective. And we really sit where the student is sitting and try to see the world from his or her point of view. And secondly, having tried to do that, what does that make us reflect on in terms of our own practice? What questions does it bring up for us, right? So pretty different from a lot of the conversations that we have about teaching and learning, which look much more like, okay, I did this worked well, this didn't work well, what do you think I should do differently? And then you've got a lot of people giving advice and problem solving. This one is actually a harder one to do. Let me see, if there, of the people who have done protocols before, how many have done a collaborative assessment conference? So you kind of got the feel. Okay, a few people, good. So let's, let me just call up our next show. Excuse me for just a minute while I